pleasure to see you all, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing the thoughts of our esteemed third speaker, Cary Nederman, who received his PhD in social and political thought from York University in Toronto and taught at several different institutions, including the University of Alberta, the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and then eventually wound up at the Texas A&M, where he is a professor of political science. He specializes in the history of Western political thought from the Greeks to the 17th century, and is the author or editor of more than 20 books. I'll just mention a few of them, beginning with Worlds of Difference, European Discourses of Toleration, circa 1100 to circa 1550, published in 2000. His The Bonds of Humanity, Cicero's Legacies in European Social and Political Thought, same dates, 1100 to 1550. And most recently, The Rope and the Chains, Machiavelli's Early Thought and Its Transformations. Professor Nederman has been a research fellow at the Center for Advanced Studies of the International Institute at the University of Michigan, and has been a teaching fellow at St. Catherine's College in Cambridge. He's been very involved in a number of initiatives creating scholarly communities of various sorts. He was a co-founder, for example, of Politica, the Society for the Study of Medieval Political Ideas. And I know him best from years we have spent together on the editorial board of the Journal of the History of Ideas, very involved in bringing people along and getting their work published as well. So I think we're in very good hands for this morning's lecture, which takes the title Constitutionalism and Consent, the Roles of Quod, Omnes Tangit in the Political Thought of William of Ockham. Cary.
Thank you. Tom, thank you very much for that introduction, and I want to thank you and Megan Hall over there and the staff of the Medieval Institute for both the invitation and for doing such a wonderful job of organizing it all. And want to thank the audience for being here. It's always nice that somebody actually wants to come and listen to me. And for people who apparently are reading my books, which is also nice. This is a great opportunity to see some old friends. Walton Nagorski, we were just talking about that. We go back to the roughly the mid to late 80s. We were trying to figure out exactly when. And also the opportunity to see a couple of other old friends, Roberto and Takashi, both of whom, of course, spoke yesterday. I know this is being live streamed, so I want to shout out to my students, some of whom in any case may be watching, as well as some friends who I invited to watch as well. So, hi guys. Okay, let me then, I guess, begin to talk about Ockham and QOT. The Roman law maxim, Quod omnes tangit ad omnibus approbatur debit, or one of very many variants on that phrase, which I'm going to hereafter simply abbreviate as QOT, which is sort of the standard way of referring to it. In any case, the maxim was a commonplace in medieval political and legal writings, as well as in documents issued by kings, popes, cities, ecclesiastical councils, and all manner of institutional and official authorities. Normally translated into English as what touches all must be approved by all. The phrase has achieved considerable notoriety among generations of scholars, and the bibliography on the topic continues to burgeon. The ubiquity of QOT during the Middle Ages cannot be doubted. The origin of the phrase, and this is a question I was asked before, the origin of the phrase derived from Roman private law found in Justinian's Code, pertaining to the succession of joint guardianship of a minor, to which each of the participants must agree. During the late 12th century, it was transformed by canon law commentators on the Decretum of Gratian into a principle of public church law applying to the process of collective decision-making by ecclesiastical chapters. This development should not be surprising given the extent to which public and private law had become closely intertwined over the course of the Latin Middle Ages. And Frank Oakley, in his recent study of the emergence of political thought in medieval Europe, in fact, has a very nice long discussion about precisely that topic. The 13th and 14th centuries saw the use of Quod in a startling array of circumstances, both practical and theoretical. It appears regularly in papal documents stretching from the pontificate of Innocent III to that of Boniface VIII. The maxim also began to find purchase in secular contexts as well. It may be located in documents originating in imperial and English courts and in the Italian communes. As a conceptual construct, Quod was deployed in the 13th century English law book on the laws and customs of England, ascribed to Henry Bracton, in John of Viterbo's De Regimine Civitatum, roughly 1250, in a treatise on general councils by William Durandus the Younger, around 1320, Marsilio of Padua's anti-papal polemic, The Defensor Pacis, which we know was completed. In fact, we just had a celebration for it. It was completed in June of 1324. And Nicholas of Cusa's Catholic Concordance, composed 1433 to 1434, among many, many, many other writings. In sum, it became a precept that served many medieval masters. Nor did the phrase disappear at the close of the European Middle Ages. Rather, the citation and application has been identified in numerous texts well into the early modern period, including some composed in the early American Republic. Bruce Brasington has a very nice book chapter on its uses in the late 18th century in the United States. There has been, however, a quite substantial divide in scholarly literature concerning the expression's actual meaning, or whether the dictum even has one at all. For many, probably the vast majority of scholars, Quod expresses a nascent justification of democracy or popular sovereignty, or at any rate a principle underlying some system of representative constitutional government that served to limit the power of rulers. Thus, Ken Pennington remarks, quote, during the Middle Ages, Quod supported a theory of consent that was a basic element of corporate theory and representative government, unquote. Pennington's teacher, Brian Tierney, asserted that, quote, the maxim was accepted as a normative principle of constitutional law, unquote. Joe Canning claims that, quote, medieval jurists employed this famous dictum in a political sense as part of the development of theories of consent, unquote. Frank Oakley has suggested that quod omnes tangit principle was applied by the canonists to corporate bodies and transferred thence into the political/constitutional realm. And according to most recently, Deborah Boikoannis, I think is how it's pronounced, quote, Quod was a mainstream of medieval constitutionalism, unquote. All of these views fall in line with a historiography that posits essential continuities between medieval and early modern political thought. Interestingly, even contemporary political theorists of various stripes, ranging from libertarians to Habermasians, have appealed to Quod for authority to support their respective views. One of those who found warrant in Quod for his position was, believe it or not, the eminent liberal egalitarian philosopher John Rawls. In his highly influential Theory of Justice, in explicating how equal political liberty has a profound effect on the moral quality of civic life, Rawls commented, quote, the medieval maxim that what touches all concerns all is seen to be taken seriously and declared as the public intention, unquote. This is a remarkable statement, indeed, given Rawls's otherwise profoundly hostile attitude towards the Middle Ages. And I could do a rant on that, but I shan't. In contrast to the understanding of QOT as a principled expression of consent, a few scholars regard QOT as to be a sort of rhetorical flourish, a cipher that could be and was manipulated to suit a vast array of legal and political arguments. According to Alan Gaworth, quote, the maxim is so sweeping and unqualified that it can be made to mean as little or as much as its particular exponent desired. Continuing that quote, it can be seen that many uses of the maxim are far from the democratic or republican orientation that it might initially appear to entail. Constantin Vassolt remarks that, quote, the principle of what touches all must be approved by all did not give any assembly any right to withhold its consent to the ruler's decision. Likewise, Art Monahan stresses the ambiguity of the maxim, acknowledging that it is sometimes very difficult to know precisely what QOT meant in a given medieval context. QOT was something less than a constitutional principle, unquote. More recently, Michel Ibert has insisted that, quote, the political and constitutional significance of QOT has been greatly exaggerated to the point of making it the medieval foundation of democracy and parliamentary representation, noting that the maxim was commonly employed to opposite effect as a way of justifying that once summoned, those who did not attend an assembly were nevertheless bound by those present. On the account of these scholars, any ascription of theoretical substance to QOT distorts our recognition of its polysemic character. Now, as is my wont, I side with the minority who defend the latter position. But they have not documented it much in detail in comparison with the scholars who adopt the opposing view that QOT conveys a substantive principle that presages some version of a modern theoretical outlook. In a recently published article, I attempted to redress this lacuna by pursuing by parsing the highly divergent ways in which QOT was put to use by thinkers of the Latin Middle Ages. I argued there for the implausibility of identifying any core doctrine, whether of constitutionalism or consent or popular rule, that may accurately characterize the employment of QOT. Indeed, the figures whom I studied put QOT to use in ways that sometimes directly contradicted one another. The phrase is, in other words, entirely flexible and pliant, depending on the historical circumstances and rhetorical positions of the individuals who invoke it. In the present lecture, I should like to underscore this point while extending it in another direction. Specifically, I investigate the multiple uses of QOT in some of William of Ockham's writings dating to the 1330s and 1340s on the nature of and relation between the church and temporal power. Before proceeding to Ockham, however, I wish to adumbrate a schematization of the factors that comprise the QOT formula in order to demonstrate how, when analyzed in specific instances, any supposed commonalities in its usage prove to be, at best, superficial, at worst, illusory. Now, I imagine that even scholars who attribute to QOT some substantive signification would at least agree that the manner of its employment was not strictly uniform. Yet no one, to my knowledge, has attempted to dissect with precision how the components of the maxim were interpreted by those who invoked it. I thus will offer a schema that I think renders coherent the many QOT references one encounters, without recourse, however, to the view that it possesses some essential meaning. It is helpful in this regard to focus on the words touch, tangere, and all, omnes, and to pose 5 related questions about their specific usage. 1, what does it mean to be touched? 2, who is the all touched? 3, how do all those touched in fact approve? 4, can all or even some of those touched disapprove? And 5, what happens if all or even some touched disapprove? The responses to each of these questions is, and I say this non-facetiously, it depends. Determining the relevant answers also requires us to confront a series of substantive issues which form the background conditions, permitting us to analyze the various ways in which touch and all are employed. For example, it matters whether the context is ecclesiastical or secular or some combination thereof. Whether those who are touched are groups or individual people, what the respective statuses are of the various groups of persons who are either touched or whose acts touch, and whether pragmatic contingency, in other words, the resolution of ad hoc problems, or fundamental principle, the establishment of a universally applicable standard, is at stake. Now, let me stress that these factors are meant to be illustrative and not inclusive. I strongly suspect that other dimensions may be germane as well. I simply intend to suggest a tentative strategy for classifying the diverse deployments of QOT in order to illuminate and evaluate its elasticity. All right, with these issues then in mind, let me now turn to Ockham. In examining the sum of his writings, I've identified 5 instances of his use of QOT, although given his sizable output, I do not exclude the possibility that there may be more. Those that I have located occur in the following set of texts. 1, a letter to the Friars Minor, Ockham's brief apologia of his contribution to the cause of denouncing Pope John XXII's heretical teachings about spiritual poverty. We heard a bit about that from Roberto yesterday. 2, the first part of his masterwork, the Dialogus. 3, the incomplete third part of the same text, composed a number of years later, although it's not exactly, we have not known with exact precision when later he composed it. And 4, a polemical treatise generally known by the insipid En Princeps, the full title of which is translated into English as Whether a Prince Can Receive the Goods of the Church for His Own Needs, namely in case of war, even against the wishes of the Pope. You can see why I didn't give you the full Latin version of it, the title. I will attempt to demonstrate on the basis of an examination of these writings the extent to which a single author could adapt QOT for a wide range of purposes without embracing any apparent coherent theoretical core. All right, let me commence then with a letter to the Friars Minor, which contains the earliest instance of Ockham's use of QOT that I've been able to locate. Addressed to his fellow Franciscans gathered at Assisi for a general meeting of the order in 1334. The body of the text is mainly composed of a close critique of 3 papal bulls issued by John XXII, condemning apostolic poverty and asserting for the papacy something that approaches infallibility. Again, Roberto spoke about one of those bulls yesterday. While residing at the papal court in Avignon, awaiting examination of his own theological doctrines, Ockham speaks in the letter of his shock at reading one of these constitutions, Quia corundum mentes, propounded in 1324. He exclaims that he had never before encountered, quote, a writing of any heretic or pagan that contained so many errors and heresies or was so devoid of philosophical or theological truths, unquote. This led him to conclude beyond all doubt is his phrase, that the Pope was a heretic. Enemies of the faith, even papal ones, are to be shunned, of course, and their declarations like any binding force. Moreover, those who do not condemn manifest heresy are complicit in its persistence and spread, since, quote, an error not resisted is approved, unquote. So who is to oppose such heterodoxy? According to Ockham, heresy must be effectively attacked by any Orthodox believer, quote, as far as each person's status permits. A question of faith when it is certain that an assertion conflicts with the truth of the faith, concerns not only a general council or prelates or even the clergy, unquote. Citing canon law, he says that laymen and, quote, absolutely every Christian must act against heresy, a heretic and heresy alike. Ockham then cites the gloss on the passage to the effect that, quote, what touches all should be dealt with by all, unquote. From which it follows evidently, he says, that a question of faith concerns even Catholic and believing women. Women have become a big issue. Catholic and believing women, on the example of many holy women who with the most constancy underwent death and martyrdom for the defense and confession of Orthodox faith, unquote. Following in their footsteps, Ockham remarks autobiographically, quote, I gladly left Avignon to devote myself in my small measure to attacking the heretic and his heresies, unquote. In this instance, the connotation of QOT seems to be radically individualistic. Each faithful Christian of whatever station must oppose heterodoxy whenever and however she or he can. Ockham regards that to be a non-negotiable requirement of the faith itself. Now, Ockham's Dialogus contributes another dimension to the story of how he appropriated QOT. The work as a whole is framed as a conversation between a master and a pupil. Its first part was specifically designed to inquire into matters of heresy, especially papal heresy. At 1685 of the Dialogus, Ockham poses the question of who may legitimately convoke a council of the church in order to examine and punish a pope who has fallen into heresy. His appeal to a general council as the ultimate source of authority within Christendom was relatively unremarkable for its time. And of course, conciliarism was to have a long and somewhat tortuous history during the 14th and 15th centuries as both theory and practice. It should be noted, however, that unlike most of his fellow conciliarists, Ockham did not maintain the infallibility of such a council. More to the present point, the master in one Dialogus proclaims that, quote, one can see that it can be proven that kings and princes and even the laity can, if they will, convene a general council and participate in the deliberations of this council. Adducing several authoritative sources to support this assertion, Ockham introduces the QOT formula and elaborates on it. Quote, all whose business it touches are to be summoned. But the deliberations of a general council touch all, because the deliberations ought to be about the faith and everything that pertains to all Christians, unquote. Replying to an objection of the pupil, the master responds that by this rule, namely QOT, is understood that all can deliberate, unquote. God designates not only the clergy, but also the laity as competent to engage in the activity of the council, since it refers to matters related to the common good shared by all, lay people as well as religious. Thus, any faithful Christian possesses the authority to assemble a council rather than just secular magnates. Indeed, Ockham takes this claim to a seeming extreme. Lay women, as much as lay men, may convoke a general council, inasmuch as matters of the faith also touch them. Thus, he says, quote, of necessity, women are not to be excluded from a general council, unquote, either in its calling or its deliberations. Ockham views this position as a logical extension of QOT and again proposes a highly individualistic conception of that maxim. Now, by contrast, when we move to 3 Dialogus, QOT is given an interpretation that falls somewhere between individualism and a form of corporatism. The 6th chapter of the 1st book of the 2nd tract of the 3rd part takes up the question of the authorization of the emperor. Ockham was, of course, a staunch supporter of the Holy Roman Empire, not least because King Ludwig of Bavaria, the claimant to the imperial throne, had been his protector since he departed from Avignon. The passage in question has sometimes been read, surely out of context, as evidence favoring a theory of consent to government on the basis of which populist or constitutionalist leanings have been imputed to him. Specifically, Ockham confronts the question of the origin of imperial jurisdiction. He begins the argument by drawing a firm distinction between the foundation of universal jurisdiction of papal office and that ascribed to the emperor. The master renounces the position that the authority of each derives from the same source, asserting instead that they are disanalogous in this respect. The Pope, the president and spiritual masters, he calls him, is ordained directly by God. The emperor of the world, the president of temporalia, on the other hand, is authorized neither by divine nor natural law, but rather by human assent. Ockham explains that as a consequence, those matters that pertain purely to the determinations of mankind rather than God or nature, quote, can licitly be changed by men because everything is dissolved by the same causes that give it birth, unquote. He appears to support this claim by reference to a quasi-social contract, such as one might associate with John Locke, and I'm going to read a longer passage about this. Quote, therefore, before one secular ruler presided over all mortals, those who wished for a just and reasonable cause could licitly consent that someone should not be appointed to empire of the whole world. For when there is a loss of liberty or power or right of some, the consent of all must be sought and had. Similarly, continuing the quotation, similarly, if for some reason it would be to the notable detriment of the common good for one ruler to be appointed to world monarchy, then for that time no one should be appointed to empire, unquote. To achieve an accurate comprehension of this passage, one needs to disaggregate two elements within it. On the one hand, Ockham is speaking of the origination of the imperial office. There is certainly a measure of individualism in his assertion that prior to the authorization of the emperor, human beings seem to enjoy a seemingly perfect freedom that is their personal attribute as a sort of natural possession. On the other hand, he refers to the office of the emperor, once it has been established, as involving the complete and irrevocable alienation of liberty or power or right. This is kind of interesting. Of course, there's been an argument made, quite a considerable number of arguments made, that Ockham is a progenitor of the idea of subjective natural rights. And of course, one element of subjective natural, and I have some doubts about that, but one element of subjective natural rights is, of course, that they are imprescriptible. And yet Ockham is saying that it is possible to renounce one's liberty or power or right. So I think this is, for that argument, which I'm not going to talk further about, that this poses a problem. In any case, Ockham's criteria yield a standard of the common good that transcends any consent, formal or otherwise. Quote, it is not and never will be permissible for mortals to enact that no one should ever be elevated to empire of the whole world, because it is not permissible to make any permanent enactment against something that is permissible to the common good as a rule, unquote. Ockham thereby distinguishes between the office of the emperor per se and its incumbency. Again, something I keep referring to Roberto, but something that Roberto's paper yesterday alluded to as well. The existence of imperial authority for Ockham, quote, is beneficial to the common good of all mortals as a rule. It can never be enacted absolutely that no one should ever be promoted to the empire, although it would be permissible to ordain with some qualifications or specifications or conditions that for the time being, no one should be promoted to such an office, unquote. Ockham's position thus whittles away at the supposedly democratic or populist or constitutionalist interpretation of QOT. Once surrendered for the sake of the common welfare, individuals no longer are endowed with the capacity to alter their decision such that the imperial system is displaced by some other system of governance. While at times the office of the emperor may and perhaps should be lack an incumbent, this in no way diminishes the legitimacy of imperial authority whatsoever. Consent is, at best, a one-time event only. it's not very Lockean, despite what people have said. A second reference in 3 Dialogus to QOT is yet more corporatist in character. Ockham addresses the issue of who enjoys the right to select select the Bishop of Rome, that is, the Pope. In his view, any bishop should be chosen by the people over whom he exercises clerical authority. The determination of the papal incumbent thus properly lies in the hands of the Romans. Quote, the Romans have the right to elect the highest pontiff, Ockham says. Those whom he is to be set over have the right to elect the one to be set over them, so that no one should be given to them against their will, unquote. On principle, quote, no one should be set over the whole body of mortals, by which he means the Roman people in their special role as representatives of humanity, quote, except by their election and consent. What affects all should be dealt with by all. For someone to be set over all affects all. Therefore, it should be dealt with by all, unquote. This leads Ockham to a somewhat convoluted logic. In their original condition, it was up to the Roman people to decide upon their own bishop. Yet, in turn, the Romans, quote, transferred their power to the emperor such that the Romans themselves can resign their right and also transfer to another the right to elect highest pontiff, of course, a reference to Lex Regia. On this account, the conferral of papal authority belongs originally to the Roman people on the basis of QOT. But the same principle allows the Romans to assign this right to the emperor, who makes the decision on their behalf. Broadly speaking, the emperor represents the people who have granted him power, who have granted power to him, but he is unconstrained by any specific terms of the consent that they have granted to his office. He determines the identity of the Pope without direct reference to the Romans, although it is presumed that he stands in for them. In this context, QOT lacks any meaningful constitutional force. The people grant the emperor carte blanche to act in their name without any form of accountability. It is simply posited that the emperor will choose the appropriate Roman bishop in accordance with his own judgment of what best serves those from whom he has received his authority. No hint whatsoever of constitutional constraint is evident in Ockham's reformulation here of the QOT maxim. Now, a final instance in which Ockham employs QOT may be found in En Princeps. The polemical context for this treatise is significant. In the summer of 1337, representatives of the English king Edward III and Ludwig of Bavaria concluded negotiations leading to the formation of an alliance driven by mutual political interest. Edward, who is in the midst of preparations to pursue by force his dynastic claim to the French crown, received from Ludwig the title of imperial vicar general per Alemannium et Gallium, an act that conferred upon him sovereign rights over subjects and lands west of the Rhine. In turn, Edward promised to provide Ludwig with the money that he required to stabilize his own position within Germany and to compel the papacy to recognize his claim to be emperor. These circumstances led Ockham, in his unique position as an Englishman at the court of Ludwig, to defend Edward's rejection of the assertion that church property enjoys a general immunity from lay taxation. The key questions for him concern the source of the exemption and its impact upon the common good. Ockham insists that no just and reasonable subject would imperil the realm and its laws by refusing to assist his ruler. Clerics are not simply by virtue of their status to be exempted from contributing to the preservation of the collective welfare of the kingdom. Ockham observes that, quote, many sacred canons require that the clergy should pay the wages of the soldiers guarding their possessions. If this is so, then clerics ought to assist the king in defending the realm, unquote. As proof of this, he invokes QOT. Quote, Because just as what affects everyone ought to be approved by everyone, so too what affects everyone ought to be guarded against by everyone. But an attack on the kingdom and the royal laws affects everyone in the country, clergy and laymen alike. Therefore, everyone ought to lend a hand in defending the kingdom and the laws of the king, unquote. All subjects of the English crown, the clergy included, have a duty to protect the public weal. Those who shield themselves, behind the cloak of ecclesiastical liberty, and yet enjoy the benefits afforded by royal defense, are guilty of a great injustice against not merely the ruler, but the whole community of which they are members. In this instance, QOT loses its apparent presumption of express consent entirely. The mere fact that the church accepts the benefits of the king's protection imposes upon it a non-optional duty to pay its equitable share. This is, as a side note, a view to which, as we have political theorists and philosophers in the room, a view to which legal and political theorists today continue to subscribe. It's known as the fairness principle. It was first articulated by H.L.A. Hart in the 1950s. And the idea of the fairness principle is that there should be a symmetry of benefits and burdens. In other words, if one benefits from a certain political arrangement, one has an obligation to bear the burdens of that as well. So, having examined the multiple ways in which Ockham makes use of QOT across his corpus, I would like to circle back to the questions about the meanings of touch and all that I posed at the outset of the lecture, and to say how they might be answered in terms of my survey. I think that it is possible, by employing my heuristic, to identify within Ockham's writings 4 distinct and divergent applications that each proffer their own answers. 1, what I call individualism. Because in matters of faith, each and every Christian believer is touched personally. Anyone, regardless of status or gender, enjoys the right, indeed the duty, to protect and determine orthodoxy. Such action might include open resistance, that is, the refusal to obey dictates pronounced by a heretic, including the Pope, the assembly of a general council of the church, and participation in the actual conduct of that or any council. 2, quasi-individualism. The position of emperor must receive the assent of all in order for the exercise of power to possess legitimacy, since individual humans are deemed to be naturally at liberty in the absence of their consent to have rules set over them. Thus, it may have been the case that sometime in the past, free people hadn't yet approved imperial authority. Once the position of emperor has been voluntarily established, however, it is irrevocable, even if at all times it may not be occupied. The office may not be occupied. 3, corporatism. The Roman people were originally endowed with the collective right to choose their own bishop, the Pope. But they transferred to the emperor their common authority to assign some incumbent to exercise the powers of the papal office. And that transmittal cannot be renounced. It thereafter pertains solely to the emperor, acting on behalf of the Roman people, but not at their behest, to determine who should serve as pope. 4, hyper-corporatism. The consent of the entire community is implied by the advantage its members accrue from protection by government, regardless of whether or not any overt approval has been conferred at any time. Therefore, all people, without exception, are subject to a given ruler such that they are obliged to provide adequate resources for the defense of the realm when called upon to do so. No valid grounds exist on which any person or group may refuse, including clerical exemption. So, Ockham's various appeals to QOT pull in different directions depending on the rhetorical context in which they are deployed. Sometimes touch pertains to matters of faith, other times to corporeal welfare. Sometimes those who are touched are individuals qua individuals, while in other cases they're corporate groups. Sometimes mechanisms are specified for extending or withdrawing approval. On other occasions, assent is formal or implied. Sometimes disapproval does not seem possible, or as elsewhere, it appears tangible and substantive. Sometimes all or a few people, or even a single person, may refuse or obstruct the command of a superior, but this is by no means always so. Is there not then, or is it not possible then, to identify any feature of Ockham's reliance on QET shared across his various references to it? It is true that all of the instances in which he depends on the maxim have the same polemical aim. They are sticks with which to beat the Pope. But beyond this, I can detect no common theoretical substance. Rather, the employment of QOT by Ockham reflects precisely the vapidity of the maxim in medieval political and legal thought, as well as in the practice of public affairs. Not only is QOT lacking in any inherently constitutional implications, it affords a thinker such as Ockham the opportunity to manipulate its authoritative status in a plethora of ways demanded by the rhetorical circumstances in which its invocation might serve expediently. My purpose, to be clear, is not to single out Ockham for intellectual chastisement, but it is perhaps the most prolific political author of the Latin Middle Ages, save only for Christine de Pizan, Ockham presents to us an especially compelling case study of how one person, and a highly skilled and original theorist at that, could handily deploy and redeploy QOT to convey a bewildering array of meanings. In the time remaining, I should like to offer some broader observations about the lessons we might derive from the case of study of QOT in Ockham and in medieval political thought generally. As I insisted in my 2009 book, Lineages of European Political Thought, and in numerous articles and book chapters published both before that and afterwards, the pronounced tendency of scholars during the last 75 years or so to stress the continuities in European political ideas between the 12th and the 17th centuries at the expense of disjunctions has produced a distorting effect. The late Brian Tierney perhaps went furthest in this regard in the closing passages of his Wiles Lectures, which were published in 1982 as Religion, Law, and the Growth of Constitutional Thought, 1150 to 1650. Now, I love to quote in full this passage simply for its sheer audacity. Quote, "The period we have been discussing is one of significant change in almost every sphere of activity. Arts changed in architecture and artillery. Science changed in society. New theologies appeared and new ways of economic life. Astronomers discovered a new heaven and explorers a new world. But through all this, improbably, patterns of constitutional theory persisted that had originally grown out of the structure of medieval society and the encounter of medieval Christian intellectuals with the secular thought of Greece and Rome." Unquote. Improbable indeed. Of course, Tierney was hardly alone in adopting this position. Going back as far as Charles McIlwain and Walter Ullman, one finds versions of it being enunciated. In addition to Tierney, some of the stellar scholars of medieval political thought from the last decades, such as the late Paul Sigmund and Ken Pennington, both of whom I consider friends, have been enamored of highlighting an unbroken intellectual chain over centuries. Consider, for instance, the name that Frank Oakley affixed to his award-winning 3-volume study, namely, The Emergence of Western Political Thought in the Latin Middle Ages. And just last year, a Stanford political scientist published a disappointing book titled Sacred Foundations, The Religious and Medieval Roots of the European State, that largely rehashed the continuity thesis in a rather turgid fashion. And interestingly, I was at the American Political Science Association annual conference last week, and this very book had a major book prize bestowed upon it by APSA. And by the way, my judgment about this particular book is not unique to me. Bill Connell, Bill Connell recently eviscerated it in a review that I highly recommend that was published in the Journal of Religious History a couple months ago. Now, permit me to juxtapose Tierney's remark with a quotation from a woefully underappreciated essay entitled, "When Did the Middle Ages End?" by my dear, and I'm afraid to say recently deceased friend, Marcia Kolish. Quote, "The issue of the location of sovereignty within the state was not settled for early modern Europe until the 17th century in most countries. These early modern arrangements, departures as they were from medieval political thought at its most basic, sometimes made use of it, from the conciliarists to Marsilio Padua to Aquinas to Magna Carta, to the theological distinction between God's absolute and ordained power. Still, the discontinuities are clearer here than the continuities, and the passing of medieval paradigms more visible in political theory than elsewhere," unquote. True to my contrarian nature, I wholeheartedly endorse Marcia's view of the matter. Now, I do not mean to suggest that nothing of value to us may be learned from the study of medieval thought. I take equal exception with the position that the political thought of the Middle Ages offers no assistance in addressing political problems of the present day. By contrast, my view is that in some, albeit not all, or by no means all cases, theories originating in the medieval period can and should contribute to the discourses of political philosophy today. As I'm fond of saying, ideas, or at least some of them, do travel in useful ways, albeit not always in the same directions. Given that Aristotle or Cicero or Locke or Kant, to name but a few, should have found places in contemporary political theory, then why not any number of medieval thinkers? I believe that some examples can be shown in which political ideas that arose during the Latin Middle Ages resonate with issues of current concern. But we must be chastened and cautious so as to avoid imprudently forcing medieval ideas to fit into modern frames, in the manner of Whig history, or if you prefer, presentism. I raise this point presently because I think that QOT affords us a quintessential example of how scholars, in their quest to demonstrate that medieval thought really wasn't that medieval after all, have over-exaggerated the modernness of the medieval. QOT, in truth, entailed no principle of consent, no substantive foundation on which to construct a constitutional theory. That so many scholars have found precisely these elements in the QOT formulation suggests to me the triumph of enthusiasm over accuracy. Thank you very much.